Chapter 8. Prisoners. Early the next morning we were put to work repairing damage done by the rain and artillery fire. Trenches had collapsed, and some were half filled with muck and water. Though it was foggy, I had a much clearer picture than the day before of where we were. The bunkers were near the top and center of a horseshoe-shaped range of hills, the slopes of which were a fortress of trenches and heavy artillery emplacements. Below was more of the same. Stretching far off into the distance was a muddy flatland of zigzagging trenches, redoubts, blockhouses, and tank traps. Beyond that lay empty flatland with nothing but black veins of charcoal. Though I could see nothing of them, the Russians, I heard it said, were encamped somewhere to the northeast, and their numbers were growing daily. Hals was in the same work detail with Jacob, Oscar, and me. We were glad to be with our friend again. Dobermann and the other Feldwebels were in charge of us, directing us as we toiled away on the grubby, back-breaking chore. We scooped buckets full of brown water from the trenches, restacked sandbags that had fallen, and filled more bags, gunny sacks, with mud. We were soon sopping wet and filthy. Of the Felds, only Dobermann got his hands dirty, so to speak, and actually helped with the work. Later that afternoon, caked with mud, bone-weary, my hands lumpy with blisters, I returned to our bunker. Having worked more than 9 hours, I wanted nothing more than to crawl into my bunk and sleep. I was cleaning up as best I could when a major's adjutant pushed in through the canvas-draped doorway to the place. Stripped down to an undershirt, pants, and boots, I snapped to attention, as did everyone, including the rat hunters, seeming as though they'd suddenly been transformed into real soldiers. The adjutant, to my surprise, called out my name. I stepped forward and saluted. "Prisoners were taken last night during a probe. Private Brandt," said the adjutant, a well-groomed, handsome man who reeked of cologne. "You will come with me, please." He did not even wait for me to get into uniform. I pulled on a heavy sweater from home and then hurrying to catch up, followed the man and his scent up a well-traveled path. Over the brow of a hill we passed row after row of tanks, then approached what appeared to be a huge pig pen enclosed by barbed wire. Inside were 20 or 30 Russian soldiers. Nearby a canvas awning at a crude desk made of boards propped up on boxes, sat a stooped-shouldered little corporal with a lieutenant with thick glasses. Magnified eyes looked me up and down as I was handed a list. "You will ask these questions in Russian, then translate the responses for me," the corporal ordered. The bespectacled lieutenant yelled to the guards, telling them to bring out the monkeys. The guards began hustling prisoners out from the barbed wire enclosures. All the Russians were barefooted, and though it was bitterly cold, most were shirtless. None had identity tags, such as those we German soldiers wore. Instead, they carried papers, which they turned over to the corporal. "How many men are there in your division? How many tanks? How well are your troops fed? Are your gasoline supplies insufficient? When is the offensive on our position to be launched?" Over and over again I asked these and other questions in Russian, then translated the answers into German. The corporal took careful notes. If a prisoner refused or even hesitated to answer, either the lieutenant or adjutant put a gun to his head. The last question, that concerning an anticipated Russian offensive, was the most important. But none of the prisoners, all ordinary foot soldiers, knew when it was to begin. Even with a gun pointed at them, the most precise answer any gave was soon. The prisoners were a dismal, wretched-looking bunch. I remembered only 2 of them at all. One was a skinny man who had been hit in the left elbow and whose bare arm looked like a bent red stick. He asked for medical attention. When I translated, the lieutenant laughed. The other Russian, I remember, was a tough-looking character who, after being interrogated, glanced at me and under his breath hissed, "Abarat," Russian for traitor. Apparently he had concluded that I was a Russian who had sold out to the enemy, not only because I spoke the language fluently, but also because I was out of uniform. After the interrogation, the prisoners were led off under heavy guard toward a wooded area. I asked the cologne-reeking adjutant what was going to be done with them. "They will be digging latrines," he replied, a tiny smirk on his face. The corporal belly laughed. It was not latrines the prisoners would be digging.